Welcome guys to episode 4 of UK Property News. This week's episode was filmed at the National Landlords Investment Show. Ian caught up with 2 experts at the event. In part 1, Ian speaks to the founder, Jermyn from Woodstock Legal Services, on the latest legal updates on the Renters' Rights Bill. So over to Ian and Carly.
Thank you, Tracy. We're recording this live at the Landlord Investment Show in Old Billingsgate. It's absolutely packed here today, but we've taken time out to have a chat with Jermyn from Woodstock Legal Services, of course. Good to see you, Carly.
Good to see you too.
I mean, it's pretty timely. We've been talking for years about, landlords' rights and tenants' rights and changes to the law, but we're now in the reality stage.
We are.
It's actually happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the one words we're picking up from a lot of landlords is there's a bit of panic out there.
There is.
Some of it is a lack of information, though.
Yeah, and it's change. People are uncomfortable with change, and on the face of it, it is big change. But actually, when you break it down, I don't think it's as scary as people think. Coming from a lawyer's perspective. And
the obvious one that people are asking is, things like tenants. If you need to lose a tenant, what's the changes there?
Yeah.
Good landlords don't want to lose good tenants.
No.
I mean, that's the first thing to say. But there are times when you might have to.
Yeah, there are, and sometimes it's unavoidable. The reality is we've had this mechanism, Section 21, for a very long time, and they call it no-fault eviction. The reality is there's always been a reason, why landlords have used a Section 21, and those reasons have been accommodated for with the new legislation that's being proposed. So, you will still have those mechanisms available. It's, the grounds available, but it's just a different mechanism to get there. My only big concern is antisocial behaviour, because whilst there will be a ground, for antisocial behaviour, as there always has been, people have tended to use Section 21 because it's incredibly difficult to prove that ground. Yep. You think about trying to get somebody to, come to court and give evidence on an antisocial neighbour so that you can support a case for eviction. It's very challenging to get people to do that. So people have tended to use Section 21 as an easier way to get rid of antisocial tenants. More straightforward, much more black and white, cross the I's, dot the T's, and you should get possession. That's how Section 21 worked. And that's why people liked it, because as long as you did everything you needed to do, you knew you would get possession. And what I think concerns people is the fact that you're asking a judge to make a decision on the day. And that's where people have their concerns. But it's a different mechanism. You will still have the grounds. The grounds are there. We're talking about that, they're proposing grounds for moving back in, selling the property, which are all reasons people previously used a Section 21. So they are there, the mechanism's different. What changes is it's not just a tick box exercise making sure your paperwork's in order, it's about you need to prove that ground. So when you're serving a notice, that notice needs to be really properly drafted with as much evidence as possible so that a tenant goes, right, okay, they're not budging, I need to move out, I want to avoid possession proceedings. And then it's when you get to court, if you have to go to court, that you've really gathered all of your evidence, you've followed the right process, and you can, in a 10-minute hearing, say to a judge, I must get possession on this day, and there's no delay. So they don't adjourn or they don't, take it to trial or anything like that. It's avoiding that. It's the uncertainty. But what landlords will need to do is make sure that they've got great evidence trails and they've really done their homework and that the case is properly presented for court.
Yeah. So a lot of this, like with so many, in fact, almost all areas of the law, it's about knowing what you're supposed to do. And being across that, searching out as much information as you can get. And literally dotting I's and crossing T's. Because you can avoid court.
You can avoid court, and we strongly support that at Woodstock. We do so much work on trying to negotiate with tenants, and try, sometimes, even when there's rent arrears, trying to write some of those rent arrears off on the base, trying to surrender the tenancy, come to an agreement that suits the tenant, suits the landlord, and being more commercial about it, and not just rushing off to court and following the Section 21 court process, which I think people have done for a long time. Keeping lines of communication open and reaching a sensible solution for both parties, and that works so much more than people realise. And I think it's really important that agents play their role in that, landlords play their role in that, and that starts from day one, and how you deal with the tenancy, how you keep that relationship going. The information you've gathered on your tenant as well is really, really valuable.
Because there's a genuine sense of an injustice. It's your house.
Yes.
Someone isn't playing ball, and you need to change that situation. Of course, during COVID and all the rest of it, we saw these proceedings go on for months into over a year many cases. I'm sure there's some even more extreme cases than that.
Yeah, and I think that's the key concern as well. Aside from antisocial behaviour, my two things I'm concerned about is the court's ability to cope with this. They've not been coping for a very long time. They're old-fashioned, they're out of date, they're under-resourced, huge investment is needed. They're struggling to cope with the amount they've got going through at the moment. The amount of claims is probably not going to drop that much at all. But what will happen is that it's not a paper exercise. Everyone's going to need their day in court. They're going to need that 10, 15 minute hearing. And that's hard to schedule in. In 10 to 15 minutes, you've got judges that sometimes, haven't done that many housing cases, or they might have been sat on a family case earlier in the morning and now they're on a housing case. New legislation, are they going to understand it? In a 10, 15 minute hearing, unless you're incredibly well prepared for that hearing, you run the risk of them saying, come back on another day, adjourn it, I want to hear more, So that's the concern. And the one thing I'll pick up on what you said, I think it's really important. I talk about this a lot, which is an odd thing for a lawyer to talk about, but mindset, because you talked about it being your home that you've rented out, and landlords need to shift that, because it's not their home they've rented out, it's their asset that they need to protect. It's a tenant's home.
Somebody else's home.
Yes, and I think if you can get that in your head, you're a step ahead, really, because you have to protect that asset, making sure the tenant you put in is good, making sure that you're looking after the property, both to protect in terms of your obligations, to keep it in a good state of repair, but you're looking after it because it's your asset and you want it to stand the test of time, and you want to, deal with any issues that may crop up in terms of the repair, so that it doesn't fall into complete disrepair and you've got a bigger bill at the end of it. So it's all about, this is my asset, how do I protect it in terms of who I put in there, how do I protect myself if I need to get them out, what are my options, but understanding all that so you can protect your asset, but really respecting that the whole purpose of this is to give somebody a home for a long period of time, not 6 months, which is the habit we got into,
of course,
and the mindset shift.
I guess with some people are accidental landlords. They inherit a house and they think, I'll rent it out, and they don't. It might be the family house, it might be the house they grew up in.
And it's
you've got to divorce that.
You do,
and kind of get your head around.
And we're
the
very
idea
emotionally attached to property in this country. It's a huge emotional attachment, and I get it. And I've been a landlord myself, and I get it. And my husband put in a lovely brand new kitchen for it only to be torn out by we had a bit of a nightmare tenant. I've been there, I understand it, and I understand the emotion of having tried to create a really nice home for somebody and them not to respect it, and then the frustrations of having to remove them, get another tenant. So I've been there, I've done it, I totally understand, but you do have to really separate yourself from that and look at it as business. And whether you're an accidental landlord, but it's not an accident, you have chosen to let it, you may have it may not have been planned, you're not a professional landlord, that's your main business, but it's not an accident, you've chosen to let it, and if you're going to choose to let it, you really have to understand what you're doing and find the right people to support you. So making sure that you've got a good agent, but making sure that you keep an eye on what your agent's doing, making sure you understand what the legislation is, what your obligations are. Come to things like this today, like people do, and really educate yourself and have good contractors, good lawyers, all of that. You need a team. It's not something that you can just do off the cuff on this as a side hustle. It doesn't work too well as a side hustle.
No, indeed.
Without the right team.
But I guess this is quite costly as well for landlords. Particularly with interest rates nowhere near where they were a couple of years ago. So the margins are sometimes not very big. So you''ve got problems with a tenant. Could be a protracted process. You're losing money. Then there's the legal costs, of course. Now, what's likely to happen there with legal costs?
I do suspect they will go up because we're not. We do a lot on fixed fees, and we absolutely will continue to do that. But the process of gathering evidence is going to be more protracted and more involved, so fees may need to go up. I'd strongly recommend people get insurance. It's a lot more comfortable when you've got your legal fees being paid and some rent guarantee as well. It gives you that breathing space, and we do a huge amount of insurance work, and we do exactly the same job as we would do for a private landlord, yet they're paying out of their pocket. They've got insurance, so I'm a big advocate of insurance,
because no one thinks that's going to happen to them.
They don't.
You hear about these situations. We had it in our own family where an absolutely fantastic tenant just at the wrong point in time
life happens
turned.
Life happens to people.
They weren't going anywhere. This guy was not going anywhere at all. You'd have got a bulldozer in there. But eventually it happened. He knew the game he was playing because he knew what he needed to do. But it
And
meant
you would, wouldn't you? You know,
six or
keep a
7
roof
months.
over your head.
No, you know, there was a rent being paid,
Yeah.
but it was still a costly
Yeah.
procedure to go
Yeah.
through the process.
Yeah, and you know that is really tough. You know, when you've
Yeah.
got a mortgage on the property, that's really, really tough. So if you can have some sort of protection in terms in place that
Yep.
just allows you to breathe, deal with it, and gives you the time to deal with it, and it may take a little bit longer. You know, it's likely to. We're looking at serious court delays already. That's my biggest concern, and I really wish that they, you know, this had been part of the process, that they would commit to investing in the
Yeah.
courts. That's a real frustration. But again, that's why you have to look at, yes, you go through the court process, you do everything at the first available opportunity, you push it through the courts as quickly as you can, but at every single point in time, you look at what are the other options.
yeah.
Can I settle? Can I negotiate with them? Can I surrender? Can I release a deposit and write off the arrears to help them move on so that, you know, they avoid a CCJ?
Yeah.
You know, we're going to have a problem where so many more tenants have CCJs as well, which
Sure.
previously they didn't because we went down the Section 21 route.
Yep.
So they avoided a CCJ. So, but you know, maybe that will help people decide who are the good, the bad tenants. But you know, the reality is even good tenants sometimes fall on hard times.
Yeah, indeed.
Life hits them, and you
Yeah.
know, you need to come up with a solution to help move them on.
And you mentioned backlogs. I mean, you know, talked about lockdown a second ago, which created huge backlogs.
Yeah.
I mean, the suggestion that that's not recovered that point
Really,
yet. It's
yeah. I
kind
mean,
of
it was bad before.
Had a knock-on
It's-
effect.
Yeah, I think, you know, blaming the pandemic, it wasn't great before. Courts vary a lot. You know, we've got a head office and we do a lot of work in Bournemouth and Poole, and Poole County Court is brilliant. You know, it's dealt with, you know, pretty swiftly. You've got
Yeah.
really sensible judges, very practical, and, you know, it feels like a fair and balanced system there. Then you've got, you know, some of the London courts, you know, there's particular names that pop up again, and we know that you'll be waiting months for a hearing, months for a bailiff. You know, that's the problem as well. So,
It's interesting. We've talked about this for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
It is now a reality.
yeah.
Because up to sort of relatively
Yeah.
recently, there was a thought that this isn't going to happen,
Yeah.
and you know, this whole renters' rights
Yeah.
bill, it'll change, and they,
No. Yeah.
and for many landlords, they think it's gone further than they initially thought.
Yes. Yeah.
Change of government and
Yeah.
all the rest of it. But
Yeah.
it's being across it that is really key.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so.
Good to see you, Carly.
Andrew, thank you so much
We
for
will
having me.
speak again soon.
Yes, no doubt.
Cheers.
Thank you.
The National Landlord Investment Show is the UK's #1 property and investment exhibition. By hosting events all over the country, we allow you to network, learn and invest.
Welcome back to part 2. Ian now catches up with Sean Hughes, who is the founder of Comprehensive Tax Planning around mitigation, inheritance tax, and also SDLT. Rates are increasing in April. What can landlords do about these rises? Have proposed changes to inheritance tax impacted landlords? Let's find out. Over to you, Ian.
And our next guest is Sean Hughes from Comprehensive Tax Planning. Good to see you, Sean.
Hi, Ian.
Never a dull day. I mean, I know people who work in tax, you know, often say, you know, how interesting could it ever be?
Yeah.
But it's never dull, right? I mean,
Sometimes it is, but
well, you're juggling lots of plates, and
Absolutely.
there's always enough movement in the world of taxation, particularly in conjunction with the world of property.
Absolutely.
Number one on the list, stamp duty. As we record this, we're just weeks away from a change.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so stamp duty is increasing, unfortunately. So the rate at which investors and all property buyers, for that matter, start paying stamp duty will return to £125,000.
Yeah.
For the past 4 years, it's been £250,000
Yeah.
to kind of stimulate property transactions around COVID time. But it's going back to £125,000, and between that level and £250,000, you're paying 2%. And then anything above that, 5%. At the standard rates, obviously landlords, it was announced in the budget in October when we were here last,
Yeah.
that the surcharge that investors pay has increased from 3% to 5%. And unfortunately, that looks like it's here to stay. It's making a good bit of money for the government again. And, you know, people ask me, what can you do to mitigate against these changes? And the only thing you can do at this current time, as we record this on the 19th of March, is try and get your next property purchase done by the end of the 31st
Or
of
don't
March.
ever buy a house.
Or don't buy a house,
That's your answer, right?
Yeah, but, you know, people who come to these shows, hopefully they're in it for the long term.
Well, indeed, and that's
Yeah.
I mean, the difficulty with stamp duty. It's one of those taxes a bit like inheritance tax in a way, that if you stood the greatest expert in front of you and said, right, justify stamp duty, they would stand there in silence for that, because nobody can work out why it's there. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Yes, it raises money for the government, but there's a genuine sense of injustice, and I think every first-time buyer has done that thing where they sit in the kitchen with a notepad working out if they can afford everything. We've done it, and then they go, "Oh, stamp duty! I forgot the stamp duty."
That bloody thing,
Exactly. And of course, it's it's not cheap. I mean, when you're talking 5%, that's a substantial amount of money. To add on to a budget that might be tight.
Absolutely, and we're talking about homeowners. Absolutely, it's a horrible taxation. Also for landlords as well, they're providing a service. There is a housing crisis, and they provide a service to the market.
100%.
But kind of how a lot of my clients justify it is if they're going to be in this for 20 years. Then it's the first 5% of capital growth that they're paying up front, really.
Yeah, true.
So if you look at it from a long-term point of view, that's maybe how you can justify it in your mind. But
are there any circumstances where you don't pay stamp duty?
Yeah, well, a big one over the past kind of 5 years was if an investor was buying a dilapidated property that was, to use a technical wording, not suitable as a dwelling on the day of completion, then you could avoid the 3 or now 5% surcharge. But there was a lot of dubious claims going in. The HMRC have took a hard line on this now, and they've won a few court cases. And where it has changed in the past 12 months is to now qualify to avoid the surcharge on a dilapidated property. You have to knock down the property and rebuild it on the same piece of land, which next to nobody does. So that was a way of avoiding it, but HMRC have clamped down on that. They've also removed multiple dwellings relief, which was a relief when you were buying multiple properties from the same vendor. So really, I'm being a bit negative here, but that's the landscape at the minute in terms of stamp duty. There's not a great deal you can do.
So it's just been squeezed to the point that people have been paying it without buying a property soon. I mean, it seems to be all over the place. It's like a rash, this thing.
Absolutely. And the worst of it is if you've got a non-residential or non-resident person buying a property, so people from Hong Kong, Dubai, or anywhere outside of the UK, they've got an additional 2% on top of the 5%. It's unbelievable, really, but that's the world we're living in at the moment on stamp duty.
And of course, if it's about, one of the big arguments is that it's anti-growth. It precludes people and say, well, I was going to invest, or I was going to start a little, beginning of a portfolio. It's just too expensive.
Yeah, the thing is, I mean, I only deal with people who are investing in property, but, like I said to you earlier, they kind of see the upfront charge as the first couple of years capital growth. And if you're going to be in it for the long term, yes, it's a pain in the backside to pay it up front, but in the long term, it's a drop in the ocean, hopefully, if the property doubles in value in the next 15, 20 years.
What about inheritance tax? Here's another one that, again, stand somebody in front of you for half an hour to justify inheritance tax. I mean, some will, but I mean, that seems, again, to many people, a big old injustice, and the rules are changing around there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the rules that have been proposed and were announced in the last budget more affect kind of farmers and trading businesses, because they're tinkering with a relief called business property relief and agricultural property relief. But landlords typically, more than 99 times out of 100, would not qualify for BPR or APR. So landlords are not greatly affected by those changes, but the thresholds at which you pay inheritance tax for a married couple, generally they are £1 million over the couple, £500,000 each. And as prices rise and the thresholds don't rise, inheritance tax is becoming a bigger issue. So we help people, plan for inheritance tax. The way we do that is, either gifting property to the next generation during lifetime. A few issues around that with capital gains tax and losing control of the asset as well. And it's really those two issues whereby people look at putting assets into trust, which, is a complex issue. But for certain people, it can work. They retain control, but hopefully can defer the inheritance tax or mitigate inheritance tax. So they're kind of the key things that people need to think about from an inheritance tax point of view at the moment.
I mean, it's like a game of Pac-Man with HMRC, isn't it? You think you've found a little route around it, and then they suddenly realise, oh, there you are. No, we're going to come for that route now, and we'll find another way. Well, you put it in a trust, don't worry, we've got a plan for that as well. So they'll come round that way. Whatever way you go, you're in a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, and it's about adapting. 10 years ago, if we sat here, it was relatively straightforward for a landlord, but then they introduced Section 24, almost 10 years ago, not being able to deduct your mortgage interest payments for personally held property.
Yeah.
So people have deviated. They've gone down the limited company route because limited companies can get full deduction for mortgage interest, and that's hopefully, touch wood, remaining as it is. And limited companies also open the door to more inheritance tax opportunities, gifting shares, gifting fractions of properties, the value of properties. So,
What about serviced accommodation? Because, and we'll explain more about what serviced accommodation is for those who don't know.
Yeah.
How do things change come April?
Yeah, well, like you've just said, Pac-Man and deviating, furnished holiday lets, so if you're letting a property short term, people call it Airbnb properties. They're a prime example. There used to be favourable tax regime for serviced accommodation. We call it furnished holiday lets in the tax world. And those properties could still get full deduction for the mortgage interest payments when held in personal name. They also qualified for something called capital allowances, where part of the building that provide a function, you get an instant tax relief for, rather than needing to wait until you sell the property. But again, HMRC or the government have closed the door on that. And from April this year, April 25, furnished holiday let properties can't deduct the full mortgage interest when held personally, and cannot claim capital allowances on any new expenditure after April. So again, they've been badly affected, and they're falling into the same camp that normal, ordinary buy-to-let landlords were in 7 or 8 years ago. So again, it's about them adapting, looking at limited companies maybe, and seeing what might work in their
Because I remember lots of people at the time saying, I'm going to go Airbnb because that is a far more advantageous investment. It makes much more sense. And a few others saying, well, give it a couple of years and, the Pac-Man is out again. And there he is. He's alive and well in the Airbnb world. So.
And it's crazy, really, because the reason furnished holiday lets got a better tax regime is because of providing more of a service. It's like a trade. It's almost like a hotel. And it creates more jobs. You need more cleaners and changeovers and whatever else. But it just more money for the government, unfortunately, and landlords have got to adapt to go with it.
This phrase, making tax digital, I fear it's been I sense it's been a slogan of HMRC for a long while. Making tax digital. And of course, the upshot is meant to be it's much easier, it's much more straightforward. Number one, it's got to happen.
At some point.
Everything's online and all the rest of it. Is it easier? Is it better in the world of property? What do we know?
We don't know, unfortunately. You've said it's been HMRC's motto for a long time. It certainly has. I started in 2008 in taxation. At about 2012, they started talking about making tax digital. They put a few.
No one even knew what it meant.
No, well, just using
the word digital was simply applied to one of those old clocks on the side of your bed. What do they mean, making tax digital? What does it mean?
So it's about obviously going more online. You have to submit your tax return online for the vast majority of people. But it's about reporting it more often and not using a tax return, using digital services basically to do it. And they brought it in with VAT. Relatively successfully, but the VAT return every quarter is 9 boxes, really easy to fill in. An income tax return where you're detailing capital gains and so on can be a hell of a lot more intricate. So they've put back the deadline many times. Apparently it's coming in April 2026. Still not a great deal of detail out there on what it's actually going to look like. So it's about keeping your eyes peeled over the next 12 months and talking to your accountant.
Because here's the thing, if you don't keep your eyes peeled and something goes wrong, the claim of naivety or innocence never washes, does it? It doesn't. It's your responsibility. So
the buck stops with the taxpayer.
Absolutely.
That it's unfortunate, but we see it in loads of court cases on tax that go to court, and ultimately the advisors a lot of the time, they wash their hands of it, and it's about the buck stops with you. So you need to understand it and
a
take
judge will say to you,
responsibility.
did you not read the 3,500 pages of guidelines? But you've got to be across it.
You have,
or have an expert to be across it for you.
Absolutely,
Listen, great to see you, Sean.
Thanks, Ian.
We will speak again very soon.
I'm sure we will.
Sean Hughes with us on the programme. We'll be back for the next episode very, very soon. Meantime, Tracy, back to you.
If you want to stay up to date with the latest UK property news, make sure that you like and subscribe to our channel.